William Dampier. For most, his name is meaningless, and that is a mistake. The son of a Somerset farmer, orphaned young, he was born not merely for the sea, but to revolutionize our understanding of it. A pirate, a buccaneer, he didn't just plunder and kill. He observed, meticulously. He recorded. He mapped. Circumnavigating the globe 3 times, he was the first to provide the world with detailed descriptions of the flora, fauna, and peoples of Australia, New Guinea, and the Pacific Islands. His journals, filled with precise astronomical observations, navigational calculations, and ethnographic notes, became invaluable scientific works. He didn't just sail, he explored. He didn't just survive, he documented. This highwayman of the seas, whose life was a series of perils, became one of the greatest naturalists of his time, a precursor to James Cook and Charles Darwin. His work, A New Voyage Round the World, became a bestseller, a staple for dreamers, and inspired Daniel Defoe to create Robinson Crusoe. Herein lies the main misconception. For us, pirates are mindless thugs, craving only gold and rum. But William Dampier became a living refutation of this simplistic myth. He was a pirate, yes, but not by calling, rather by circumstance. And this pirate turned out to be one of the most discerning scientists of his century, capable of mapping unknown lands with astonishing accuracy in an era without satellites or GPS. He gave the world knowledge, immense knowledge. His legacy is not a myth of corsairs, but a testament to an insatiable thirst for discovery, capable of manifesting even in the most unexpected guises. The son of a farmer from humble Somerset, William Dampier experienced loss and hopelessness before his peers learned to read. Orphaned at 12, he lost his last remaining relatives by 16. The land that fed his ancestors promised no future, only endless toil and poverty. It's no wonder the gaze of a boy who knew no affection or support turned to the horizon, to the boundless expanses that promised either freedom or oblivion. Dampier's first steps at sea were typical for thousands of similarly dispossessed youths. He became a cabin boy, then a sailor, learning the harsh science of survival on merchant ships. He sailed to Newfoundland for fish, then to Indonesia, discovering not only navigation, but also the darker side of colonial expansion, brutality, injustice, and the absolute cheapness of human life. It was there, far from civilized shores, where law was a mere whisper and survival dictated its own rules, that Dampier encountered those known as buccaneers. These maritime predators, outcasts from society, lived by their own code, plundering Spanish galleons and coastal settlements. For Dampier, homeless and defenseless, joining them was less a choice than the only way to stay alive, to find some protection in a world that had rejected him. But unlike most of his brutal comrades, whose minds were occupied only with rum, gold, and bloody massacres, Dampier never lost his capacity for observation. His eyes saw not just plunder, but details, currents, stars, coastlines, the faces of natives. His hands, accustomed to hard labor, now held not only weapons, but also a pen, meticulously recording every fact, every deviation from the norm, every nuance of the unknown world. This paradoxical thirst for knowledge, strangely blossoming in the very heart of pirate lawlessness, became his true calling. It transformed a mere wanderer into a future explorer whose records would outlive both him and his bloody exploits. The pirate ship became for him not a prison or a place of profit, but a floating laboratory where each day brought new, invaluable data. However, to understand how a farmer's son could become one of the greatest naturalists of his time, one must examine the tumultuous forces that shaped the world of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. It was an era of colossal change, where global ambitions clashed with harsh realities and a scientific hunger for knowledge paradoxically coexisted with a ruthless struggle for power and wealth. Europe at that time resembled a bubbling cauldron. England, Spain, France, Holland, four maritime powers desperately vied for dominance over the world's oceans. Their rivalry extended far beyond land borders, turning the boundless expanses of the seas into battlefields. Colonies worldwide became not just sources of raw materials, but strategic strongholds, vital for controlling trade routes. The trade in spices, silk, and precious metals from the New World in the East brought fabulous profits, but also demanded immense risks. Merchants and crowns were willing to do anything to expand their territories and gain access to new resources. In this chaos, where official wars often spilled into undeclared raids and state interests intertwined closely with personal gain, maritime brigandage gained a peculiar legitimacy. Governments issued so-called privateering commissions, transforming ordinary captains into legal plunderers of enemy ships. The distinction between a privateer, a buccaneer, and a pirate became blurred, depending only on political expediency and the distance to the nearest court. In this era, when world maps were still full of blank spaces and every new discovery promised not only scientific glory, but also colossal economic benefits, an insatiable thirst for knowledge awakened. The 17th century became the cradle of the scientific revolution. Royal societies were founded, scholars across Europe exchanged ideas, striving to catalog and understand the surrounding world. Telescopes revealed the mysteries of the heavens, microscopes, invisible worlds. New species of plants and animals, unseen peoples, uncharted lands, all required description, classification, and mapping. Voyages ceased to be mere trade expeditions or military campaigns, they became missions to expand human knowledge. It was this blend of avarice, geopolitical struggle, and scientific curiosity that created the ideal conditions for figures like William Dampier to emerge. The world was vast and unexplored enough to offer boundless opportunities for discovery. It was brutal enough to push the dispossessed to the most desperate paths of survival. And it was enlightened enough to value knowledge, even if it came from the most unexpected sources. Under such conditions, even aboard a pirate ship, one could find not only gold, but also invaluable data capable of changing the world's perception. It was in 1680, deeply immersed in a world of lawlessness, that William Dampier witnessed and participated in one of the most audacious and grand schemes of his time, the famous buccaneer raid across the Isthmus of Panama. This was no isolated foray. Hundreds of desperate desperados, armed to the teeth, traversed the deadly Darien jungles to descend upon defenseless Spanish settlements on the Pacific coast. The goal was not mere plunder, but total devastation, the seizure of silver, gold, and slaves. This operation was a cynical, meticulously planned affair where every life, be it a Spanish colonist or a native guide, had only one price: profit. Dampier, then young and inexperienced, not only survived this hell, but surprisingly continued his meticulous records. Amidst the cries of victims and the clash of blades, he documented geographical features, river currents, the customs of local tribes, never suspecting that these notes would one day become part of invaluable scientific work. He saw not only plunder, but also an opportunity to map the unknown, even if the path to knowledge lay through blood and chaos. After this bloody enterprise, Dampier temporarily left the buccaneers, attempting to find a more settled life. But fate, or rather his insatiable thirst for adventure and knowledge, once again threw him into the embrace of the sea. In 1686, he joined Captain Leonard Swan's expedition, which intended to cross the Pacific Ocean. Initially declared a trading mission, it quickly devolved into another adventure when the crew, intoxicated by the lure of easy riches, forced Swan to return to piracy. However, the true, most cynical scheme unfolded when Captain Swan, weary of the excesses and unwilling to risk his life further for the insatiable pirates, attempted to change course. The crew's response was brutal. Swan and several other officers were simply marooned on the uninhabited island of Mindanao, condemned to certain death. This was not merely a mutation, it was betrayal, the cold-blooded elimination of an inconvenient leader, a grand scheme perpetrated in the name of boundless greed. Dampier, being just one of the sailors, could not influence the outcome, but he was a witness. He saw how a brave captain became a victim of his own subordinates. And once again, against the backdrop of this moral catastrophe, his pen did not stop. He described the islands they passed, their flora and fauna, the customs of the natives, even if the ship he sailed on was now merely a floating prison for his own ambitions and a tool for others' crimes. These two grand schemes, in which Dampier participated or was a direct witness, were for him not just episodes of his biography. They were his universities, his research fields, his laboratories. Within them, at the very depths of human cruelty and avarice, not just a pirate was forged, but a scientist whose capacity for observation and documentation proved stronger than any chaos or threat. It was these risky ventures, full of deception and betrayal, that gave him unprecedented access to the most uncharted corners of the world, transforming him from a homeless wanderer into one of the greatest naturalists of his century. However, to survive, and moreover, to thrive in this ruthless world, William Dampier required not only a sharp mind, but also a unique personal toolkit that allowed him to navigate between deadly dangers and his own ambitions. He was not a fearsome captain dictating will, nor did he possess the charisma to ignite a crowd. His strength lay elsewhere, in his ability to use others' vices for his own ends and in an absolute, almost animalistic, adaptability. Dampier quickly understood the main driving force of the buccaneers, an insatiable thirst for easy gain. He did not try to change them, but learned to skillfully play on this greed. His meticulous records of currents, depths, and uncharted shores, which for him were scientific data, became treasure maps for the pirates. He could point to a safer passage to a Spanish settlement, predict weather conditions that could disrupt a raid, or hint at the existence of fertile, unguarded lands where supplies could be replenished. Such information was invaluable. When every step in the unknown ocean promised either death or untold riches, Dampier's precision turned risk into calculation. He did not command, but his knowledge was utilized, his advice heeded, because it led to gold. This was a unique form of influence, not through command, but through the demonstration of undeniable, vital competence. He was acutely aware that in a world where every second person was ready to stab you in the back, his survival depended on his uniqueness. Dampier was not the best fighter, but he was the best cartographer. He was not the most experienced sailor, but he was the most meticulous observer. This role as expert on the unknown gave him a kind of immunity. Pirates could rob, kill, and betray each other, but they needed someone who could guide them through storms and reefs, who could distinguish fertile land from a barren patch of ground. Dampier became indispensable. He knew how to choose allies not based on friendship, but on their usefulness for his own research, whether native guides who knew local customs or experienced navigators capable of confirming his astronomical calculations. He created a micro-network of experts around him, gathering fragments of knowledge that he then systematized in his journals. His personal adaptability was astonishing. He changed ships, crews, even professions, from merchant sailor to pirate, from buccaneer to captain, and then to naturalist. He survived hunger, disease, betrayals, and mutinies, always finding a way back to his main passion, understanding the world. He did not become attached to one place or people. His only constant was his notebook and pen, which he guarded with his life, even when hell raged around him. This detachment, this focus on his own goal, allowed him to remain an observer, even in the most desperate situations, not consumed by chaos, but using it as an opportunity for research. He did not fight against circumstances, he used them, turning every pirate raid into a scientific expedition and every act of betrayal into a lesson in survival. It was this unprecedented flexibility and ability to profit from any situation, even the darkest, that made him not just a survivor, but one of the greatest discoverers of his time. This notebook, which he guarded more than his life, became the key to a new world, not only for him, but for all of Europe. When his records finally saw the light of day in the form of A New Voyage Round the World, it had the effect of a bombshell. The work of a pirate, full of precise observations, maps, and ethnographic sketches, became a sensation. It was not just a bestseller, it became a staple for the learned men of the Royal Society, for ambitious merchants dreaming of new markets, and for the Admiralty, eager for new lands. William Dampier, yesterday's rogue, transformed into a national hero whose knowledge was recognized as invaluable. It was these influential circles, from enlightened minds to government officials, who became his main patrons and beneficiaries. To them, he was not just a teller of exotic tales, he was a source of strategic information capable of shifting the balance of power on the world stage. But the triumph of recognition held a new, no less dangerous trap. In 1699, when the Admiralty tasked Dampier with commanding the HMS Roebuck on a mission to explore Australia, his bitterest trial awaited him. On board, discontent was already brewing among the crew. The true antagonist, whose shadow fell over the rest of Dampier's life, turned out to be his own lieutenant, George Fisher. This man, whose biography has dissolved into history, but whose actions left an indelible mark, became the embodiment of bureaucratic envy and intrigue. Fisher, unable to comprehend Dampier's scientific meticulousness and his sometimes unorthodox command methods, constantly undermined his authority. He openly disputed orders, turned the crew against the captain, and ultimately, when the Roebuck found itself in critical condition, it was Fisher who became the chief accuser, bringing Dampier to court-martial. This was not merely a conflict between two personalities, it was a clash of two worlds, the world of the free explorer, accustomed to the anarchy of pirate life, and the world of strict military discipline. Accusations of cruelty, incompetence, and improper leadership rained down on Dampier. The court, held in 1702, found him guilty of unfitness to command any of His Majesty's ships. He was fined, and his reputation, so brilliantly built by his publications, was tarnished. This was not just a personal tragedy, but a grand injustice, undermining faith in a system that supposedly valued knowledge. His patrons turned away. His beneficiaries fell silent. Dampier's legacy was threatened, and his path to new discoveries seemed forever blocked. The chief pirate scientist was defeated not by a Spanish galleon or tropical fever, but by betrayal and a bureaucratic machine he could never fully comprehend. The verdict, handed down by the court, struck Dampier with devastating force. Found unfit to command any of His Majesty's ships, he not only lost his position and was fined all his earnings for 3 years. His reputation, so painstakingly built over decades of risky research and successful publications, lay in ruins. Yesterday's national hero, whose books graced the desks of scholars and monarchs, became an outcast. The Admiralty, which had only yesterday extolled his unique knowledge, now turned its back, and his patrons, who had seen him as the key to new lands and riches, chose to forget his existence. This was not just a defeat, it was a public stoning, the destruction of everything he had fought for. The world that Dampier had so eagerly explored now seemed closed to him. The path to new discoveries appeared forever blocked. Without a ship, without funds, and bearing the mark of disgrace, William Dampier found himself back where he started his journey, a dispossessed wanderer, but now also rejected by society. His fall was painful, yet paradoxically, it did not completely break him. The thirst for knowledge, though muffled, continued to smolder. While his name was dragged through the press and his former associates avoided him, Dampier did not give up. He sought any opportunity to return to sea, even if it meant again treading the precarious line between legality and piracy. Such an opportunity arose. In 1703, in the midst of the War of the Spanish Succession, he received an invitation to lead a new expedition. It was a risky venture, privately funded, and semi-privateering in nature. 2 ships, the St. George and the Cinque Ports, were to sail to the Pacific to plunder Spanish ships and settlements. For Dampier, this was a last chance to redeem himself, prove his worth, and reclaim his name. He seized it like a drowning man, grasping at a straw, perhaps not realizing he was treading on the thinnest ice. This new mission, instead of becoming a triumph, turned into a series of disasters, culminating in his definitive downfall. Dampier, accustomed to independent sailing and complete freedom of action, was unprepared for command in the context of a strict privateering expedition where every crew member chased their share of the spoils. Conflicts with subordinates, especially with his second captain, Thomas Stradling, erupted constantly. Accusations of indecisiveness, incompetence, and even cowardice rained down on him. He failed to quell mutinies, failed to enforce discipline, and his scientific interests, which had previously been his trump card, were now perceived as a distraction. He still kept his records, but on board, where anarchy reigned, this only fueled discontent. The climax came in 1704 when, after a failed attempt to capture a Spanish galleon, Dampier and Stradling finally fell out. The crew divided. Stradling, supported by the majority, broke away, leaving Dampier with a smaller part of the crew on the damaged vessel. This was not merely desertion, it was open defiance, public humiliation, a grand mistake by Dampier, who failed to maintain authority over his men. In essence, he repeated Captain Swan's fate, but this time he himself became the victim of his own inability to manage a crew. Dampier, left to his own devices, attempted to continue the raid, but his expedition ultimately descended into chaos. His ship, the St. George, became unseaworthy, and the crew was forced to scuttle it, transferring to a captured Spanish schooner. The survivors, exhausted and disillusioned, were eventually captured by the French. Dampier became a prisoner, spent several months in jail, and then, thanks to a prisoner exchange, was repatriated to England in 1707. This return was not that of a hero, but of a broken man. He brought back neither riches nor new discoveries, only shame and further proof of his unfitness. This was the ultimate unmasking of the myth of Dampier as an invincible explorer and captain. He was a brilliant observer and writer, but a catastrophic leader. His inability to manage people, his detachment, and at times indecisiveness, which in the pirate world could be perceived as weakness, ultimately led to his complete collapse. His last attempt to return to the scene ended in complete fiasco, solidifying his reputation as a failure and casting doubt on all his past achievements. It was then, in 1707, that William Dampier's name finally faded into oblivion, overshadowed both by his own mistakes and by the harshness of a world that never truly understood his genius. It seemed that William Dampier's ignominious return in 1707 marked only the final act of his personal drama. But the catastrophic failure of his last expedition across the Pacific, which resulted in his capture and complete ruin, had far more significant consequences, affecting influential circles. Private investors who had risked capital hoping for fabulous profits from Spanish gold and silver lost everything. Their investments, amounting to tens of thousands of pounds sterling, a colossal sum for that time, simply vanished, yielding not an ounce of precious metal. These funds, intended for financing other commercial ventures or land acquisitions, were irretrievably lost. Many creditors and shareholders, especially representatives of the merchant class, found themselves on the brink of complete ruin. Their business reputations were undermined, and trust in such ventures, based on risky privateering raids, plummeted. The London financial market, already accustomed to speculation on overseas enterprises, received a tangible blow, forcing bankers and merchants to exercise much greater caution when considering new projects involving long voyages. The Crown, though not a direct sponsor of this semi-privateering venture, still faced an awkward situation, especially in the eyes of influential trade guilds and the aristocracy whose members had invested in such enterprises. The failure of such a highly publicized mission, led by a once national hero, cast a shadow over the very idea of using private individuals to expand imperial interests. In the midst of the War of the Spanish Succession, where every naval success had not only strategic but also propaganda value, Dampier's fiasco became another blow to the prestige of the British fleet and its ability to protect trade routes. The Admiralty, which had already once turned away from him after the Roebuck court-martial, now definitively struck Dampier's name from the list of potential commanders, officially stripping him of the possibility of ever again commanding Royal Navy ships. His unique knowledge, capable of serving the Empire's interests in cartography and naturalism, was discredited by his inability to manage people and the complete lack of discipline on his ships. This immediately led to stricter requirements for privateering commanders and a more cautious approach to issuing commissions, especially to those with tarnished reputations. The risks associated with uncontrolled private enterprise became evident, forcing the Crown to reconsider the mechanisms of interaction with private initiatives and giving preference to more centralized and controlled expeditions directly sponsored by the state. Thus, Dampier's fiasco, beyond his personal tragedy, catalyzed changes in British maritime policy, shifting the emphasis from risky private adventures to more structured state-backed projects, which in the long term influenced the development of British naval expansion. The curtain fell. William Dampier's name, once heralded in books and in the corridors of the Admiralty, now was only whispered, or not spoken at all. His final years, spent in relative obscurity, completed a tragic arc of a life that began in poverty and ended in oblivion. It seemed history had erased him, leaving only the simplistic image of a pirate incapable of command. But it is here that the greatest deception lies, the grandest mystification history played on one of its most unusual sons. The truth turned out to be far more complex and paradoxical. While William Dampier faded, his intellectual legacy continued to live on and influence the world, but without his name, without his recognition. His journals, full of precise descriptions of flora and fauna, meteorological observations, ethnographic notes, and, crucially, unique maps, continued to circulate in scientific circles. They became not just a source of inspiration, but the foundation for subsequent, more respectable expeditions. James Cook, the greatest explorer of his time, kept Dampier's A New Voyage Round the World as a bedside book, relying on his maps and descriptions as he charted his own routes. Charles Darwin, a century later, also drew upon Dampier's works when studying the wildlife of Australia and the Pacific. Thus, the knowledge gleaned by a pirate amidst lawlessness became a cornerstone for future scientific breakthroughs. Yet the name of the original source was either forgotten or deliberately distorted. The world, craving simple answers, preferred to see Dampier only as a buccaneer, confirming the stereotype of the mindless brute. This was convenient. It fit within the framework of common perception. Society was unwilling to acknowledge that the greatest discoveries could be born in the dirtiest, most immoral conditions, that genius could sprout from the soil of crime. For if a pirate could be a scientist, how then could one distinguish hero from villain? This dichotomy was too complex for the collective consciousness. Therefore, his scientific achievements were attributed to cleaner figures, while Dampier himself was left with a dirty but understandable label. And in this lies the main universal lesson of his story: a person's true value, their contribution to the development of civilization, does not always align with their social status or how history remembers them. William Dampier was a genius of observation and description, a man whose insatiable thirst for understanding the world surpassed any craving for gold. He was not a perfect man. His life was full of compromises, mistakes, and moral failings. But it is this paradoxical combination, a pirate who became one of the fathers of modern oceanography and naturalism, that makes his figure incredibly significant. His legacy is not a myth of an invincible captain, but a testament to the fact that knowledge and enlightenment can break through any barriers, even if the path to them lies through chaos and injustice, and the discoverer himself remains in the shadow of his own, more historically acceptable successors.